Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads. I'm Joshua Knobe. I'm a professor of philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill.
And I'm Anthony Appiah, and I teach philosophy at Princeton.
So, Anthony, in recent years you've written a lot about the concept of identity and the sort of philosophical implications of that concept. But recently you've been suggesting that maybe an understanding of identity can help us not only with these kind of abstract philosophical problems, but also with understanding current electoral politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's very striking to me that if you look at the current electoral campaign, look at the primary between Senator Clinton and Senator Obama, issues of identity are just absolutely central to explaining how people have been thinking about it. The identity of the candidates, Senator Clinton's identity as a woman and Senator Obama's identity as an African American, has interacted with the identities of voters, so that, for example, we can predict that a large proportion, very high proportion of African Americans will vote for the African American candidate, but a very large proportion of the female candidates, voters have voted for the female candidate.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the influence of identity was more powerful in the primary, or that it's still just as powerful even now in the general election?
Well, I think it's going to be there in the general election, obviously, because people are, for one thing, people are very conscious, for obvious historical reasons, of Senator Obama's racial identity.
Mm-hmm.
And one reason that I think that some people would like him to win is that they would like there to be an African-American president. And when I say some people, I don't just mean people who themselves are African-American.
And so when you say that people want there to be an African-American president, are you thinking that people want that because they think the president, if he was African-American, would adopt certain policies or promote a certain agenda, or just for the sake of having an African-American?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this case, and it's just an instance because it's quite general in our politics, is that people vote for candidates for all kinds of reasons that don't have anything to do with policy.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a piece before the second Bush election, pointing out that many of the people who voted for, who went on to vote for
mm-hmm.
President Bush as an evangelical, because they were evangelicals themselves and they wanted an evangelical president like them, had no very good reason to think that the policies that were associated with evangelical politics would be much advanced by having an evangelical in the White House, and indeed they haven't been. Abortion is still legal, gay marriage is still happily tripping its way towards acceptance, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So are you thinking that electoral politics, maybe it's similar to, for example, if someone was going to name a street after a philosopher, then if they were wondering, should we call it Plato Street or Nietzsche Avenue, there may be a lot of philosophers who would be up in arms and feel really strongly that it should be one or the other, but not because they think naming of the street in this one way or in the other way would have any kind of impact on the nature of our city. It's just kind of something about expressing a certain kind of identity.
Yes, I think that's right. We when our identities are engaged in these sort of public symbolic acts, we're not wanting the street to be named after Plato because that will change American philosophy or anything else. We want it to be named after Plato because we want to express our identification with that particular way of thinking about what philosophy is, a way that makes Plato an important philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
And politics is just full of examples of this sort of thing. When I first came to this country, there was a great deal of activity around the question of South African divestment on campuses, and many people were happy to agree that it wasn't clear that divesting from Southern Africa would, in the short run at least, have any serious impact on the policies of the South African government. But what they wanted to do was to express their revulsion for those policies and to disassociate themselves from them, whatever the consequential effects, whatever the non-symbolic effects.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of responsible, realistic people often object to this sort of thing. They object when people want to shape policies around these symbolic effects. But I think it's a mistake because I think, even whether it's a mistake or not, it's an absolutely central feature of politics, and you just have to accept that people are going to be engaging in symbolic acts all the time in politics, and that gives scope for the application of, for the engagement of their identities, because one of the things people care about is whether an act expresses respect for a certain identity that they may have, and so on.
So if you think that, if you aren't one of the reasonable, responsible people who thinks that we could move toward a less kind of expressive politics and one more based on consequences, is that just because you think it's hopeless and we'll never be able to get there? Or is it because you think there is something deeply right about having this politics of expression where you seek to express your identity through your voting?
I think that it is important, as it were, who we are for politics. And the way we express who we are, the way we, in fact, fix who we are, is to a certain extent by what ideas we express or what aims are expressed by the way we behave politically. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an inevitable and not an undesirable feature of politics. It's obviously undesirable if people get so obsessed with the symbolic that they forget about all the practical consequences of policy. But I think, and one of the reasons why I think we've got to have this kind of politics of identity is because we live in societies that are so enormous. Mm-hmm. And the only way in which you can engage, really, with other people on the scale of tens or hundreds of millions is by way of identifying with them as fellow Americans, for example, or fellow Chinese or fellow Indians. Mm-hmm. And that symbolic identification then leads you to have concerns, practical concerns, but practical concerns that are not about you in particular. I care about the fate of my fellow Americans because I'm an American too, and I care about it even in the cases where there's no direct effect on me. I don't think that anybody in this country should be denied access to reasonable health care. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I happen to have access to reasonable health care already through my Princeton employment doesn't weaken my sense that it would be better if my fellow Americans had it too.
So you're thinking that even in the cases where people are concerned about the consequences, for example, the cases when they're concerned about their fellow Americans having health care, the reason why they're concerned about the consequences ultimately comes down to the sense of identity. It's not just that they think it would be a good consequence for the Americans to have good health care, but that they identify themselves in a certain way as an American, and then there's a kind of expression of that identity they have when they care about other Americans having this.
Yes, I think that if we don't have that kind of connection with one another, we simply can't connect our wills, our emotions, our feelings, and our dispositions, our desires enough to do what we're supposed to do in a republic, which is to take collective responsibility for the running of our lives together.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, there have actually recently been some experimental studies of this question as to whether people's politics is inevitably expressive or whether people can get out of this ability to just express themselves and care about the immediate consequences of what they're doing. So there's this issue that arises often about harm reduction. For example, if people are going to be using heroin anyway, should we try to express our distaste for that by making it illegal for them to get needles? Or should we worry about the consequences and therefore make sure that people who are going to use heroin anyway at least have clean needles so that they don't, for example, end up spreading AIDS? And many people say in that kind of case, well, expression from expression, we shouldn't care about that. We should care about us having good consequences on people's lives. We shouldn't worry about things like expressing our distaste. We should worry about making people's lives better. So it's important to give people those free needles. But then psychological studies by Pizarro et al. Try to test the balance of this ability to choose consequences over expression by looking at other kinds of cases. So they would present people with questions like, suppose the military knows that soldiers overseas often rape the native populations. And then they think, well, since they're going to be raping these people anyway, maybe we should provide them with free condoms so that at least when they rape these people, they don't spread sexually transmitted diseases. Or suppose we say to these people, we notice that gang members often end up shooting non-gang members in drive-by shootings because they just miss the people they're trying to shoot and end up shooting innocent civilians instead. Should we then provide free marksmanship lessons to gang members so that they can accurately hit other gang members instead of hitting innocent pedestrians? And when you ask them these kinds of questions, people immediately say no. But what's interesting is, if after asking those kind of questions, you ask them about the general principle of harm reduction, should we try to produce the best consequences, even when by doing that we'd be expressing something or failing to sanction something that we find distasteful? People reject the principle. So it seems like only when they're considering a certain narrow range of cases do they end up thinking of the consequences as what's important. As soon as you go out of that range, they think what's important is to express something about themselves, as opposed to produce the consequences that are truly best.
Right. Well, I think that these are very interesting experiments, but I don't find them too surprising. I think that when people say that what they're mostly concerned about is harm reduction, they're thinking about cases where there isn't much else at all. From their point of view, there isn't too much else at stake. But as soon as you find yourself having to think about an act which not only has a practical consequences, which may be, on balance, a good one in the circumstances, but where, in doing so, you're expressing an idea or symbolically associating yourself with something that you don't like, then I think we often want to say no. And this was, again, very strikingly true, I think, in the case of that of the divestment issue. People didn't want to be associated with South Africa's policies, even if you could persuade them that a divestment was actually going to make things worse on balance for black South Africans. They just felt they didn't want to be associated with it. And what I want to say is, look, both of these things do matter. You shouldn't pursue the politics of symbolism with a completely blind eye to the effects of the policies. But you can't think. I think politics won't work if we restrict ourselves only to thinking about the non-symbolic effects of our policies.
So are you thinking that those people then who say that we should just worry about the consequences, so that, for example, we shouldn't divest from South Africa because it won't have good consequences, or that, for example, we should give free condoms to 14-year-olds because at least then we'd have better consequences than if we didn't? Are you thinking that maybe those people, the reason they say that isn't because they genuinely care only about the consequences, but because they secretly don't think that these things are really that bad? That they're not that troubled by apartheid in South Africa or by teenagers engaging in sexual activity?
Yes, I think that's one explanation. Another explanation is that some people are very preoccupied with seeming rational, but and so this is a characteristic of economists. They want to just look at the effects, and they think it's irrational to care about anything else. And so, but again, I think even with them, in their private lives, as it were, you can point them to cases where they think that other things than effects matter. And as I say, this is in large measure connected with the fact that in our moral lives we care not only for the effects of what we do, but of who we are. And who we are is not simply fixed by the effects we aim at. It's fixed as well by the ideas we express through the things we do and the things we won't do.
So far what we've been talking about in terms of who we are these identities, like, for example, being a woman or being African American. But it seems like one other thing that plays a really important role in electoral politics are certain other much more subtle kind of identities.
Yes. I mean, first of all, of course, the most obvious thing to say is that one thing that plays a large role in our politics is political identities. People think of themselves as Democrats and as Republicans. And again, this is one of these cases where many people think this is just many of the sort of rationalist people think this is crazy. They say, why shouldn't you just focus on policies? But I think there are at least two reasons why adopting a party identity isn't, in fact, so crazy. One is that you have to live your life. And we simply don't have the time to explore every policy for ourselves and make up our own minds about it. And so one reasonable thought is, well, I should vote for and support people who are like me, on the assumption that if they're, as professional politicians, they're going to look into these matters, and they will look into them with an attitude that's like mine, and so they will come to the conclusion that I would have come to if I had had time to think about it.
But are you thinking that party identities are like identities in this broader sense, so that, for example, if someone is a punk, then they listen to certain kind of music, to punk music, but they also dress in a certain way and have a certain kind of hairstyle and so forth? Are you thinking that party identities are coming to occupy this kind of role in people's lives?
Well, actually,
if you're a Democrat, you eat tofu, and if you're a Republican,
one of the interesting things about recent politics, I think, is that we've gone into a phase where there's more, where party identities have become a little bit more like that than I think they were in the past in the United States. When I came to the United States, I came from having been in Europe in Britain for a decade, and there it seemed to me party identities were very much more about policy. Parties had manifestos. You could look at the policies and see whether you supported them, and then you support the party whose policies you mostly supported. When I came to this country, it struck me that the Republican and Democratic parties were these large coalitions, and that many, as it were, liberal Republicans had policies that struck me as more like the ones that I would favour than many conservative Democrats.
Oh, so the liberal Republicans, maybe they would agree with you on policy,
yes,
but they somehow have a different hairstyle, or they eat different foods and listen to different music. They identify themselves.
Yeah, and they hang out with different people, and they think of themselves as connected with different historical traditions. Party. But does one think of the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln, as it were, or whatever? But I think what's happened more recently, since I've been in this country, is that it's become a little bit, politics in this country, in that respect, become a little bit more like the way I understood British politics to be. That is to say, they've actually become more like collections of agendas. The Democratic Party is the party of the centre-left, and the Republican Party is the party of the conservative right. And to that extent, they're sort of less like identities and more like bunches of policies than they used to be. But it's still the case that there are surely many people who just feel, oh, I couldn't vote for a Republican, or oh, I couldn't vote for a Democrat. Not because they're convinced that that the combination of things that the Democratic Party would pursue is evidently worse than the ones the Republican Party would pursue, if they think of themselves as Republican, but because they have this identification. And the identification is not just about policy. It's about who you are. And I don't know enough. I didn't grow up in American politics, so perhaps I don't have a strong enough sense of how you might think that way about these party labels. But clearly many people do. I remember my mother, who was a member of the British Labour Party, as was her father, used to, when asked by people why she voted for the Labour Party, used to say, well, I vote for the Labour Party for conservative reasons. I vote for the Labour Party because my father did. And there were people who identified with that party as a sort of family matter. And that, of course, is true, I think, of some liberal Republicans probably were people who identified with the party as a family matter, and the party's policies shifted away from the ones that they perhaps favoured, but they still felt tied to the party.
So, in these last couple of elections, it seems as though identity has played a very special role in that, for example, President Bush seems to have this very visible identity of being kind of a former frat boy, and he has this kind of frat boy image that maybe makes people who are aligned with that certain kind of identity vote for him, independent of any of his policies. And similarly, maybe you might think Kerry comes off as a kind of morose intellectual, and other morose intellectuals, regardless of whether they agree with his policies, maybe just feel drawn to his manner.
I think that we've been talking about identity because that's sort of, as it were, our topic, and I think it is, as we've been seeing, very central to our politics. But I think there's another thing that is going on with the current president, President Bush, which is that people like to vote for people who they think would like them, people they would hang out with, and if they hung out with them, they would expect them to get along with. And many people feel about President Bush, that they would be able to get along with him, that he would like them. Now, identity plays a role in that. Of course. Many people feel that, well, I'm born again, he's born again, we should get along, he should like me, we should be able to be pally. Many people feel, well, I'm sort of frat boyish and he's frat boyish, and so we should be able to get along, he'd like me. So identity plays a role in these guesses about whether you would get along with people, and But it is, in the end, it's the issue of how you would feel about them that's often important to people. And my impression was that one of the problems, as you said, as you implied about Senator Kerry, was that people felt not only that he wasn't a sort of very cheerful fellow, but that he probably wouldn't like them. Indeed, he probably didn't like anybody very much, and that put them off. So we have to remember that in most elections, most people vote the same way if they vote every time, and it's only a small proportion of the population that shifts. But even the proportion of the population that is never going to vote for a Republican in the foreseeable future, for example, votes with varying degrees of enthusiasm for the Democrat. And I believe that part of that enthusiasm, that range of difference in enthusiasm, comes from questions of identity and identification.
So maybe at this point we could turn to your philosophical theory of identity. So according to you, what are kind of the elements that make something actually be an identity?
Well, I think the simplest way to put it is that it's very important to grasp that identities have both objective and subjective elements. The objective elements come from the fact that there's a rough set of ideas in the society about what conditions you have to meet in order to count as a person of a certain sort. You have to have significant African-American ancestry, perhaps, to be an African-American. And you have to have, certain kind of bodily arrangements to be a man or a woman. But by themselves, those would just be ways of classifying people which didn't have the power of a social identity. For them to have power, they have to come to mean something to people, and that means that they have this subjective side where people who have the identity come to think of it as giving them reasons to do and to feel and to think things. I ought to do this because I'm Jewish, or because I'm black, or because I'm gay. These are reasons for me to act in a certain way. And so it gives a kind of subjective power to it. And this power that it has to motivate people to act in certain ways and to feel in certain ways isn't just a power that it has for those who identify, because, of course, people also treat people in different ways in virtue of their identities. And so people who aren't African-American respond to African-Americans as African-Americans. And so their relations with black people are shaped by their sense of that identity. And key, I think, to the subjective component of identity for the people whose identity it is, for people who identify in a certain way, I think is always the idea that there are norms, there are things that people of that identity ought to do. Take religious identities, for example, Muslims ought to make the Hajj to Mecca if they can. They ought not to eat pork. They ought to give charity, especially on Fridays. I mean, these are norms that go with being a Muslim. And many people feel that there are norms that go with being a man. My being a man is a major part of the explanation for why I don't wear dresses. I don't myself feel deeply the desire to wear dresses, but if I did, the fact that I'm a man might stand in my way. And in fact, the fact that I don't have that desire is probably connected in some deep way with my sense of myself as a man. And that norm of it's not a moral norm. It's just a norm of dress. What used to be called a sumptuary norm. That norm is part of the meaning of my gender for me. And of course for most men in this country, though in Greece macho men wear skirts in the army, and in Scotland, as we know, macho men wear things that look awfully like skirts, but they call them kilts. So these are culturally variable things, but nevertheless they are part of the background of what gives meaning to these identities for us. And I think it's crucial as well to grasp not only that it has these objective and these subjective sides, not only that these norms are important, but also that there is nevertheless contest and disagreement all the time about all these elements. There are disputes about who really counts as African American. I remember a conversation once between one of my nephews, who's half Norwegian and a quarter British and a quarter Ghanaian and blonde and grey-eyed, with one of my African-American nieces,
Mm-hmm.
and she told him he was black.
Mm-hmm.
And he, coming from Norway, found that very puzzling since he didn't look black. This is a dispute about the meaning of this racial identity.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, there are, of course, very many disputes about the norms that are associated with identities. People disagree about whether, if you're African American, you ought to support affirmative action. Is that one of the norms of African American identity? Many people feel about many of the ethnic groups that you have some kind of obligation to act in solidarity with members of your ethnic group. But some people think that that's ridiculous, and they just want to, be loyal to their friends and to people that they like.
Mm-hmm.
So these norms are out there, and we know about them, and we sort of understand very often the range of beliefs people have about these things. But that doesn't mean that they're uncontested, and somebody might know that there's a norm of solidarity for black people and just think that it's a bad idea and want to resist it and want to argue against it and want not to conform to it themselves.
So, on your theory, when we find that the conditions for attribution of a certain identity are contested in this way, so that some people think that in order to count as an American or an African American or a woman, you have to meet these conditions, and others a different set of conditions.
Mm-hmm.
In those kind of cases, how can we adjudicate the question? Is there a right answer that we can ultimately find as to what you really do have to be in the same?
I think that, at least in general, the answer is no, that there isn't a correct. Where there's contest, the only thing that we can say is that there are usually core prototypic examples which you must get right. So you don't count as really grasping how we use the concept African American if you don't recognise that Jesse Jackson is an African American and that Jesse Helms isn't or wasn't. If you don't get that right, then you're sort of outside the range of competence with the concept. But if you get the prototypical cases right, the standard cases right, then I think that it's just part of the social facts that we need to observe in a society, that beyond that, reasonable people can differ, and that there's no mechanism for resolving. There's no mechanism standing outside the system to say, okay, this is the correct answer. Now, I say this because I think I used to think something different. I used to think that with these matters of description, especially in relation to race, that because people thought of racial identities as fundamentally rooted in biology, we could ask the biologist what somebody really was. And that if there was a scientific answer to that question, then there was a correct answer. The trouble is, in that particular case, of course, that most of the scientists were inclined to say there wasn't a correct answer because they didn't think race was really a biological concept. It's a concept that other people wanted to say was biological, but the biologists themselves, the people who understand the structure of human populations and the way genes are distributed through the world, felt that it wasn't a helpful way of classifying people. So, in the case where you have some reference to some sort of technical scientific notion, maybe you can find resolution. But often in our social lives, people think that there is a technical answer, and there isn't. Or the technical answer is very different from the one they expect. Most people, I suppose, still think that there are basically two genders, two sexes, two biological types, that men and women. And the fact is that once you look at the range of human morphological variation, you see that for a variety of reasons, people can come out with various forms of so-called intersexes, and that it's, on the whole, not a sensible question to ask about the intersexes. Well, are they really one thing or the other? There's just no determinate answer to that. It's better to say, in the scientific classification, we're going to use 5 or 6 categories, and the informal everyday classification is just imprecise, and there are people who don't fit very clearly on either side of the line.
So suppose we determine that, from a biological perspective, it makes no sense to speak of people as falling into a certain number of races, where, say, white people form one race and all black people form another race. And then, suppose we now have a dispute whereby some people think since it didn't turn out to have any biological relevance, this notion of, say, being a black person, then the whole category is a mistaken one, and there really are no black people. This is a mistake. And other people say there is some notion of being a black person. It's just not a biological notion. It rather has a sort of social notion. So this is sort of the former you, and then various other philosophers on the other side. Are you thinking now that there's no answer to this between these two views?
Well,
there's no right answer which of the two is right?
I think you can argue, you can make the case for each side, but in the end, what you're really arguing about is whether it's helpful to go on talking in a certain way. And that involves partly predictions about what will happen if we change the ways we talk, which of course we don't really know in advance. But also, I think, it involves giving different weights to different considerations. And there's no obvious rule that says which consideration should be given the greatest weight. If we were to abandon talk of racial identities and try to stop thinking in those terms altogether, certain traditions, certain African American traditions, for example, of music and religious life and so on, might come to be, in the end, impossible to sustain. And you might think there was something good about those things, and that in losing this way of talking, you'd lost something that was worth trying to hold on to. Those sorts of judgments strike me as judgments that people reasonably can differ about. And so there isn't, I think, again, there isn't some point outside the dispute to stand and adjudicate and to say who's right and who's wrong. I think the only thing you can do reasonably, if you care about these things, is to participate in the dispute yourself, to point to the consequences of going one way rather than another, as you predict them and as you see them, and to suggest what weight you should give to the different consequences that there might be.
So in a certain sense, there is a way to argue about these questions. It's just that in arguing about them, you're not, as it were, trying to find some antecedently existing correct answer. You're trying to think about what would be the best way of living and what would be the best way of categorizing.
Good. Yes, I think that's a very good way of summarizing the view. And look, I mean, sometimes people have said, when I was arguing that we should just abandon talk of race, people just said, there are all these things in our society that you would just not be able to explain or understand if you didn't talk about race. And I said, look, in that respect, we could say the same thing about the society I grew up in and witchcraft. You don't believe in witches, I'm sure, I said to my interlocutors, who, being American philosophers, mostly agreed. You don't believe in witchcraft, I'm sure. But you can't understand lots of things that people do in the society that I grew up in without understanding what people are thinking when they say that someone is a witch, and the sorts of things that lead people to treat people as witches, and the sorts of things that witches, if there were any, would do and want to do, and the norms that witches would feel governed by.
So you might think then that anthropologists, like say Evans Pritchard, studying cultures that believed in witches, would find it helpful in describing a culture to just say, so-and-so actually so-and-so was a witch, and that was why these certain people behaved in a certain way.
Right.
It would have a kind of explanatory power.
Yes. I mean, he might sort of say it in a kind of, in a sort of quotation mark sort of way, as I am inclined to do when I use the word race. I don't I use it, but I'm inclined to put it in quotation marks, just to record my sense that many of the presuppositions that go with talking in that way without the quotation marks are false. But, of course, you can easily find yourself in situations where you yourself forget about the quotation marks. Evans Pritchard has a lovely account of this, where it says, sometimes at night I would see these flames in the bush outside the village, and I would think, oh, a witch. And then I would have to remind myself that I didn't believe in witches. But he was in the place where everybody did, where that would have been the normal interpretation. And so, and living there, it was natural for him to go along with it. So similarly here, I think it's kind of conceptually fussy to the point of prissiness to refuse to say that Senator Obama is an African American on the grounds that nobody really meets a coherent set of criteria for being African American that are shared by all users of the concept. That's true. I mean, there are no coherent criteria that are shared by all users of the concept. But still, he's going to count as African American on almost every sensible account that takes that notion to be a notion that's applicable in our society, and you can explain and understand many things about people's responses to him, and indeed many of his own feelings about how he ought to act, how it's reasonable for him to act, on the basis of his being an African American, or his thinking of himself as an African American.
So far we've been talking about this question as to how we should be classifying other people and what kind of concepts we should use in classifying them. But what we were originally discussing was not just what kinds of ways we divide people up in their identity, but also the role that this plays, for example, in politics in deciding who to vote for. So at that time you were just talking about how people actually do vote for, decide who to vote for. But if we turn now to the kind of question we're asking at this point, how people should behave, do you think it's good that we have these campaigns that are based so much on identity, or do you think it would be better if instead people just talked more about the policies that each candidate was going to adopt?
I think we, as I said, I think it's very hard to imagine a kind of politics in which these identity played no role at all. That's because of the way our psychologies work. And I think reasonable politics has to take account of how of the mechanisms of identification and mobilization and solidarity that are built into human psychology and that are engaged all the time in political processes and have been always. We need them because we have to have collective action. We have to solve many problems by acting for the corporate whole, for the society, it might be for New York City, it might be for New York State, it might be for the United States, but we need ways of making policies that reflect the concerns and the interests of everybody in those groups. And in order to engage us, you have to engage us, as it were, as we are. The way we are is we're identity-bearing creatures, and Americans in particular, for example, are very much mostly think of themselves as patriotic, and what that means is that they think of themselves as people whose American identity matters to them, and you can use it you can appeal to it, and appeal to their Americanness to get them to do things. Now, in the end, it's going to be important if our politics is to be in any way successful or decent, that we do focus on getting certain things done, on getting people healthcare, on getting the economy moving, on avoiding unnecessary wars, dealing with terrorism and so on. And these are all things where there are practical, non-symbolic issues at stake. A dead person is a dead person, however you represent him or her, and these deaths are, whether they're because of failures of healthcare or failures of anti-terrorism policy, these deaths are things we'd like to avoid. But I think you just can't get at almost any of them in practice without getting at them through people's identities and identifications. So what I hope is that we do so in a way that is somewhat that is responsible, as it were, to the real ethical issues at stake. I think we ought not to use people's identities to, as it were, manipulate them into doing things that we think really ought not to be done, though they happen to suit us. We should be scrupulous in attending to what policies ought to be carried out. But I think that once we have made the right judgments, the right moral judgments, the right ethical judgments about what policies we should pursue, then I think we have to get people behind them by appealing to them through symbols and through their identities, and we can do so honourably because we can do so to some extent transparently. That is, we can say, this is what we're doing. I appeal to you as an American. There's nothing. That's transparent. It's not dishonest, and I think it's a useful and a positive thing.
So what we have to do is first figure out, say, what is the best healthcare policy, and then once we've done that, then we have to kind of appeal to people through a certain kind of identity to get them behind that healthcare policy.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, as I say, this is a point that actually Richard Gorter used to make, that the right thing to say about some of our policies in relation to healthcare and to social welfare is simply to say to Americans, look, let's agree, no American should have to live like that. That isn't a straightforward moral argument, and it isn't an argument that's going to work for somebody who doesn't feel the pull of an American identity. But it's an argument, and it's an argument that can be made to work.
And so you're thinking it's just a fact about our psychology that given the kind of creatures we aren't going to be creatures who are just going to be swayed by arguments that say, well, from a perspective of your identity, this might look terrible, it might be expressing all the wrong things, but look, it will make this 3% decrease in certain kinds of health problems, so maybe we should adopt it.
Yes, I think, yes, realism requires us to acknowledge that we can't always do that. You might think that it's a two-stage process, that in deciding what to do, we don't need to consider identities at all. That we just have to decide what's in our power and what the best policy we can think of is to achieve the best outcomes. And that the identities only figure in the second stage.
But you know, there are some studies indicating that liberals and conservatives differ across this dimension. That liberals are much more inclined, relative to conservatives, to kind of override their initial feelings or initial identifications and just base the decision that they ultimately make just simply on the consequences. In fact, there are even studies looking neuroscientifically at these kind of problems where they measure the error-related negativity and find differences between liberals and conservatives, such that liberals are more able to kind of override an initial pre-potent response in favor of doing something that would actually bring about better consequences.
Yes, it's since the history of sort of liberal political theory is a history in which begins by thinking of people as rational agents and as being entitled to some extent to sort of to democratic self-government just because they're reasonable people who are entitled to manage their own lives. And so, I think it's natural for someone whose basic picture is that to want to be reasonable and to ask his or her fellow citizens to be reasonable too. So I think it's sort of it's not these psychological dispositions are not explained by the philosophical theory, but it's not surprising that they go together. Now, I think even liberals will mostly find cases where they are not able to persuade themselves that you should attend only to consequences. And that's in part because one of the central liberal ideas is a deeply symbolic idea. It's the idea of human dignity. It's the idea that there are ways in which people ought not to be treated, people ought not to be thought of, and those matters of what's sometimes called recognition, which is using the Hegelian concept, those matters of recognition are also central to liberal politics. And I think that you asked earlier whether it isn't often the case that when people are trying to get us to focus on the sort of practical ends of things, it's because they don't think the symbolic elements in the situation matter very much. And I think it's true that about many of the most contentious issues in our politics, which a lot of which have to do with gender, liberals do just tend also to be people who think that the symbolic stuff, the stuff of sort of standing against sexuality except within marriage and so on, just they may think, well, it's probably not a good idea for children to have sex, but they don't care about it with the passion, perhaps, that many more conservative people do.
So the rhetoric of liberals is something like, of course it's wrong for children to have sex, but we have to be rational about this and recognize that it's going to happen and make sure that they have these condoms. But what's really going on is that they're just saying, well, whatever, if he wants to do that, it would be fine.
Well, it's maybe that the weight that they give to stopping young people having sex is just less, and and on the other hand, the weight that they give to reducing the rate of sexually transmitted diseases is greater. So I think we shouldn't, if we're liberals, we shouldn't be too pleased with ourselves on the rationality front.
Of course, it could be that the attempt that liberals, or say certain economists, show it to be perfectly rational is itself just the expression of a kind of identity. That is to say, they identify themselves as these people who are very rational and always considering the consequences. Yes. And then the real reason they're considering the consequences is not out of an urge to bring about the best consequences, but out of an urge to express that identity as someone who just carefully weighs things up and doesn't get moved off into some crazy right-wing paranoia, but considers each thing.
Yes.
If they could sort of get the joy of expressing that identity without even bringing about any good consequences, then they'd really have what they cared about in the first place.
It's a tempting thought. And what I've been saying can sound like encouraging people to think that it's just a mistake to aim to be not to aim to be reasonable, not to express a reasonable identity, but just to be reasonable. I'm not. I mean, I think that I don't want to be understood as suggesting that we should encourage people to be sort of even less rational than they are, and reason has an important place in our politics, and to the extent that we can, I think it's helpful when we reason together. All I'm saying is that partly because consequences aren't the only things that matter to people, and rightly they aren't the only things that matter. Who we are is not just a matter of what we're trying to do. It's a matter of what we express through our lives as well as what we achieve in our lives. Partly for that reason, we can't simply turn our politics into a politics of just consequences. But yeah, I don't want to be heard to be suggesting that, hey, anything that appeals to your identities is fine, and appeals to reason should be regarded as mere rationalization. No, we should reason, but we should recognize that being governed by reason alone is basically impossible for ordinary human beings, and that therefore we have to construct a politics in which we accept that people are going to be driven by other things, and that we should try and understand the other things that they're driven by. And I think one of those things, not the only thing obviously, is their identities and their identifications.
Well, on that very reasonable note, maybe we should conclude.
Great. Well, I have seemed as reasonable as I'd like to.
So thank you so much for joining me.
It was a great pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.